Cool.
Yeah, all right. I'll probably go over it faster than I recorded it, but I think it's worthwhile to do it now. Let me see. I'll share my screen. Oh, that's the wrong one. Which one is it? This one should be it. All right. So now to the presentation. Hi, welcome. Dimitrie Hoekstra, product designer, verify, continuous integration. So let's jump right into the next one. DAG visualization is the issue we're intending to build in 12.9. So we're doing the ideation right now. There's been research that has gone before it, but before that, let me explain a little bit what a directed cyclic graph is. It's a finite directed graph with no directed cycles, as Wikipedia states. So basically each job can depend on any other jobs, and this gives the user a lot of flexibility, right? So they can have a little bit more of a flexible structure in the pipelines instead of all jobs in the stage depend on all other jobs of the previous stage. And this kind of helps them remove any bottlenecks in their pipeline. So quickly, let's see what has happened in the past. In 12.2, we had the MVC implementation. It uses the current stage-based visual pipeline model. It was kind of like part of the MVC scope, do the minimal, and then see how we can improve from there. Kind of the current problem is that this visualization model does not support DAGs really well. So even though multiple jobs and multiple stages are all starting at the same time because they do not require or depend on a full stage anymore, but just on a few jobs, for example, it is not really clear what is happening from the visualization standpoint. So Laurie did actually the good job of figuring out the problem because we wanted to know, hey, what is going wrong exactly? What are the users doing? And all of the information is kind of very much needed for the ideation I'm currently doing in 12.8 for the implementation in 12.9. And then, for example, we'll have some follow-up solution validation, and there will be things way out of scope for 12.9. So there will eventually be potential follow-ups. So let's quickly jump in. Here's an example of a mini pipeline graph and the full pipeline where you see multiple stages, jobs are starting. But the lines, there's like a CSS bug, but even if that was fixed, it is not really clear why, for example, the review prepare stage job inside of there is starting while the jobs before that in post-test stage are also still running. So that's one of those problems we're trying to fix. The business decision, I'll quickly go through this. We want to basically avoid creating different modes and also avoid confusion as we currently have. So there's a clear initiative to move forward with this. The hypothesis, there's confusion. Yes, there is. Laurie has found that out for sure. And people use the pipeline stage to see the status, to troubleshoot pipeline failures. That is indeed true. But they also need to find out a little bit more, right? They need to have that dependencies visible and in order to see how the pipelines was architected or even to troubleshoot certain jobs. And lastly, there can be one mode that conveys all three kinds of pipelines. This one is a little bit less visible or that less defined in the research, but I think this is kind of like the problem to tackle from the ideation perspective. By the way, Laurie, feel free to jump in if you have any comments. If not, the user personas and implementer personas, there's kind of like a different tactic for both of them. While the user personas are more interested into troubleshooting, the implementer persona, which is in that case the DevOps engineer, is very interested into how the pipeline was architected, see if they did it right or need to make any changes. So some highlights of what we found out, it's the order of jobs is important to know, both for troubleshooting and for the pipeline architecture. Status and progress are important. This is not something just from this research, but is a theme that's coming on from multiple. So interesting to make any changes into this for multiple reasons. Let me see, it's the visual model. That's the one actually to edit in this presentation. Doesn't make much sense, this one. But let's see, the current workarounds is kind of like an interesting one. What are people currently doing? They're either scanning logs or reviewing execution time. For example, the Jenkins has a dedicated view for that. This is very inefficient and kind of makes the job very hard for people. Well, it should be relatively simple. Logical groupings, which is a theme I'll come back to a little bit later, is making a lot more sense in DAGs, while, for example, in a stage-based pipeline, stages are making sense, but they're a manual thing by the user. While for DAGs, we have a lot more flexibility of what we'll do with that information that the DAG is, how we're going to present it, which groupings make sense. I'll come back to that in a little bit later. Don't overwhelm the user with information, kind of like a standard thing, but I think it's additionally important for big data visualizations, and we want to make sure that we help the user instead of overwhelm them. And then lastly, there's the need for performance optimization. This were some of the insights coming out of the research were in this direction. I do think that this is currently out of scope, but that there is a high need for this. Where is the bottlenecks happening, but also which jobs are taking very long. And this, I think this DAG will eventually already set the first step in that direction, where you can see, hey, this job, which has an insanely long execution time, but also has many jobs dependent on this, that is a high, high priority item to fix. So we're going to the direction, but I think there's a whole new problem space to discover there as well.
Dimitrie,
Links in the, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry for interruption, but just a quick question, just on make sure that everyone on the call knows what DAG stands for and like what it is actually, because I wasn't aware before talking to you on this issue, of course. Just, yeah, I know that probably you will dive into that a bit more, but just like. Yeah,
so a DAG basically is a pipeline where each job can depend on any other job prior in that pipeline. And we're making it possible currently for a job to depend on any job, even within the same stage. So there is a direction inside of the pipeline, but the jobs themselves can now independently depend on other jobs instead of complete stages. And it kind of is shown here a little bit in the top right, where you, for example, if you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 jobs, while the for last job depends on 2 other jobs. So it depends on the one directly going before it and another job before that. And it's the same one with the last one, right? The last one depends on 2 other jobs to be completed before it can begin. Does that kind of answer your question?
I think, yeah, just so curious how, if anyone else has any questions about that, like does everyone else understand what Dimitrie is talking about?
I did, absolutely. Only because I cheated and I worked on this briefly for 2 weeks when I first started here. But it is the graph, I think, is the easiest way to wrap your head around it.
It's kind of an abstract concept, right?
Awesome.
Yeah, I think it will be a little bit more visible in the visual examples I will have.
Right, 100%.
But appreciate the question for sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure because this will help people to give you feedback later on. But please continue. Thanks for clarifying.
Let me see. So I was here. Then we have the pipeline models. This one is actually interesting for one specific one, which is this last one. So we have the stage-based approach. The current pipelines can still remain stage-based if we want. This new capability, which we already support, is DAG jobs, so jobs depending on just jobs instead of stages. And then we have the hybrid where we can do both at once. We currently support DAGs being just dependent on other DAGs. Then we have the stage jobs be separate completely as well. And then we have the 2 other ones, so DAG jobs which depend on jobs that are within a stage, and stage jobs which can depend on other stages. That is basically the classic model and goes a little bit back into the stage-based approach. But then the last one, and this is I should be easier to explain, is that DAG jobs, instead of depending on just another job or multiple jobs, we might want in the future to be able to say, hey, this job actually depends on a stage. So it's kind of like going in between the hybrid and making the dependability a little bit more flexible. But it isn't really super relevant to the current problem space, but it is interesting to point out because I think the graph should be able to support this regardless of us supporting this in the CI. So if we decide to implement it, it's easy to implement and the front end is already capable of showing it. I don't want to spend too much time. So if you have questions about this, I would say, let's put it at the end because it is less about this problem space currently. The jobs which we'll focus on is a pipeline graph. That is the main evidence space where the user will go, both the implemented persona as well as user persona, in order to figure out, hey, what has gone wrong, right? Or, hey, how is my pipeline architected? The mini pipeline graph is more basically for troubleshooting, what is in progress, etc., more for user persona. So there's already one persona missing. I would say for now, we're going to keep this out of scope, as well as that it already kind of works with a DAG as well, because there is how the system currently works, that even if you don't define a stage for a certain job, for example, a DAG job, because it doesn't really make sense, the system will still define it a stage. It will define the first stage, which is most of the time test. It will have that, and in that way, it will always show up in the mini pipeline graph. So it is not something that we break currently. It will just look a little bit funny, but it kind of shows a way like, hey, there's logical grouping, which in this case is the manual stages, and you will be able to figure out, hey, in for example, all the stage with all which fails, and you can easily find that out. By the way, did you hear me still? I see my audio is giving me some problems here, it seems.
We lost you for last 15 seconds.
Okay. For some reason, the AirPods were connecting. So the idea here is basically we'll focus on the pipeline graph because the rest is interesting to look into, but is secondary and will result in a lot of scope creep. And I think the pipeline graph will have the highest priority here. Again, what information do we need to present? This, I'm listing this more as, hey, if you see, if I'm missing anything, please let me know. Async is possible, sync is as well possible. We're going to depict the status, the dependencies, right? Which jobs when before this job was triggered, the stage, if any. I'm going to go a little bit away, but it's a deeper topic. Are we going to show that stage, which is kind of induced by the system, if we have a pure DAG pipeline that is no longer necessary, but it's interesting perhaps to show. A type, so it's either a job grouping. So for example, if multiple jobs have a certain naming pattern, they're concatenated into a single node to make the pipeline graph a little bit more wieldy. A project, for example, upstream and downstream, and a child pipeline, which we kind of visualize in the same way, but they both have this trigger job before it, which kind of like triggers that. Action elements, so action buttons, you want to retry a job or want to activate a manual action, and of course unique information such as the job name, project name, the ID of the pipeline. Those kind of things are necessary to be shown. Then characteristics. I think this is one of the more interesting slides here. We want to be able to see how the pipelines are architected in a quick and efficient way, and what the path towards a certain job is. So it's kind of nice that it needs to work for both small and huge graphs. The pipeline graph from GitLab is already pretty big, but I suppose that some of our clients have even bigger pipelines to tend to, and perhaps make use of mono repos. Dependency line should have clear and expected structure, so the cognitive load stays minimal. I think this is kind of interesting. If we look at one of the earlier or the examples I'll show in the future, you can see that some of those graphs do not have this this characteristic to them and make them harder to read. And there's a clear direction. I think this is pretty interesting. One of the examples I'll show will have this immediately, and some others as well, while others do not. And this is a directed cyclic graph, so it will have a direction to it. But I think it's kind of nice that we can potentially visualize this without resorting to arrows and like, hey, the direction is top down or left to right. This kind of should be clear from the structure of the graph, basically. Let me see which other things are kind of important. Accessibility, of course, interactability. Perhaps we want to be able to zoom, stretch things out. Action items should be possible to click into. This kind of like important for front end for feasibility. And, of course, this one is kind of interesting. If a job has multiple other jobs depending on it, that job should become more visible because that is a more high risk job. If that job fails or if that job is taking long, we want to know immediately or as soon as possible because it's a high risk item. And we have some solutions for that in the future. Pipeline graph, I'm going to skip this one because I said before, this is out of scope for now. So let's look at some DAGs. Here's a kind of like a simple version in the left top corner. And in the bottom right corner, there's a little bit more of an, more complex one. You can immediately see with the more nodes added and the more dependency lines added, things quickly add up to a more complex structure. And also the direction in this right one is very hard to gauge, and basically it's all over the place and it's not easy to read. Basically the graph will look differently every time you're going to look at it based on the amount of nodes it has and how it executed. So there's some downsides to that one. So logical groupings, right? Stage-based grouping is kind of limiting to DAGs. It doesn't really make sense. It is something that the user has intended, but the system might be able to show us far more efficient ways to kind of scan the graph for troubleshooting and pipeline architecting or order of execution, right? So here are some ideation examples. For example, I focused in on, for example, hey, which ones are completing, which are running, which are directly next up, and which are waiting on multiple dependencies to finish up first. Kind of like a downside is that eventually all end up in the completed column, which makes then after you look at a completed pipeline, it totally unreadable. But it was interesting to look into. Here's one which kind of like has this Gantt chart going on where you can see, performance optimization going on. Jobs will take longer, will, show kind of like a timeline, a kind of node-based approach. This kind of goes into the wrong direction for the current problem space, as it kind of goes into performance optimization rather than, order of execution and that kind of thing. But it was interesting to see how one leads into the next. And there's some competitor products that do this as well. So the only thing that actually makes sense from my side, but I would love to have feedback if you think differently, is dependency generation. So I'm going to show that in the next one with the examples I had before. 7 will be the first generation, and 5 and 6 will depend on 7, so that will kind of be the second one, and so forth. 4, 2, and 3 kind of be executed at the same time if 5 and 6, the first generation, right, kind of finishes. They will not all run at the same time, but it's kind of like dependency generation will be a consistent thing, and it will allow the user to pre-render this graph regardless of its execution times. And that is a big win because that kind of like eases the user while scanning the pipeline when it's still running, but also when it's already completed. And I'll go into an example of the more complicated one after this. So here we have the simple one. I was playing around with this. You can easily see how it can kind of like go look messy, but there is some kind of direction in these examples. Then we look at, different directions. We look at, hey, what if we highlight certain ones? For example, here in the bottom one, you can see, hey, what are the direct dependency paths towards this highlighted node here? It's kind of interesting what you can do with the interaction of a graph. And then here we have the more, complex one. You can easily see how it becomes kind of hard to visualize, keep that direction going. There's a lot of things that, can easily be hard to read. But this generation, dependency generation is still quite clear. So there's like 1 level, 2 level, 3 level, 4 level, 5 level. It at least gives the system a way to pre-render the graph without it needing to do so in real time. But it kind of displays this need from our ideation point of view that we need to iterate faster, because if we look at the previous one, this was kind of hard to create, took a lot of time because we all do it manually, and the big pipeline should also be able to work. So I looked into this tool, which is called Observable. There are similar tools, which I think are more familiar with Python. This one uses a lot of JavaScripts and NPM packages, if I'm right. But what this is basically a node tool with a live code base in it, and allows us to live play with other examples. So people have uploaded these kind of examples where they created DAGs in a linear fashion, or the one that we've seen before, or this one on the right even, which is more of like a graph node and kind of has some direction to it, a lot of text in it. It's like there's different examples to be found. However, then I found this one, which is kind of pointing us into the right direction. The things have a clear direction, easy to read. It has this dependency thing ongoing, so we can easily see, hey, chaos is the first root generation, while the other ones depend on that, and so forth. And then we have the right one, which is kind of like goes into this metro kind of style, where, for example, if a metro station has more lines that go away from it, that metro line station visualization, or that that abstract visualization of that metro station, will become bigger and will become more visible. One of the characteristics that we were looking before. So I played around with this a little, and instead of like family, where you'll always have two parents, and new people will be married to children. That doesn't make sense for our pipeline kind of way, where we want to see, all right, which jobs are the first generation of dependence, which basically jobs without a root dependency, and then the second one and the third one. However, the problem here was, and this is something where I need front end to work with me, is that the script of this pipeline visualization is not yet up to the task for this, and it creates these glitches, but it kind of shows us the way that we can. Here's a little bit of a simpler one. It's the relatively complex one, and you can immediately see here what's going on, but the script is not yet up to par. Again, what we need to show, I think this is kind of interesting. How can we hack the system a little bit? The stage header, for example, how can we show this hybrid kind of thing, right? Where we have both DAG jobs as well as stage-based jobs. And this is where I ideated into the following proposal, where we, for example, can see, hey, this is job. These jobs depend on this stage, but this job depends on, for example, this stage. Basically, this is the one that we should not support yet. But hey, this was quickly thrown together eventually. And this is something I would like to have feedback on, in terms of like, hey, do you see any immediate problems with this? Is this too much information or not? But you can see here, for example, with this job in the bottom, where it has not run yet, that it will have the dotted lines, and it will have multiple jobs depend on this job. This job will have no dependencies. It's part of this stage group. These kind of things are all possible. And there's the trigger job, the project name for like a downstream pipeline, for example, which can be expanded and then show in line. I think we have a real opportunity here to do the right thing with downstream pipelines as well, which can already expand in line as well as upstream models. But now we have this kind of like dynamic graph visualization, which will be able to expand and adjust based on the information present. But again, this is going to be a real feasibility discussion with front end, though the code for the pipeline, which I showed earlier, which is this one, for example, I have readily available for front end to look into, and kind of like pick it apart and see how usable it is for our system. Though it uses the D3 JavaScript library, which is something that was offered by frontend before to look into and have a real possibility of implementing this. Lastly, and this is the last slide, what is up next? So solution validation after we've implemented it, because it's scheduled for 12.9. Let's look into, have we actually solved the problem, or what remaining problems are there? And of course, the things that were out of scope, different logical groupings and different visualizations, for example, for performance optimization. And that's it. Kind of like a big project, but I think a very interesting puzzle to solve, though it will heavily depend on feasibility with front end and back end. Back end will have less problems, have I heard of my discussion with Fabio, but Peyton will probably be responsible for the front end implementation of this. So we'll see from there. Any questions?
This is super interesting. It's like, whoa, really need to. I mean, I remember when we first discussed about like upstream and downstream pipeline, but I never thought it could get this complex. My first point is not really a comment, but yeah, you can confirm this. The first thing I thought when you start showing it was subway map, right? So all the jobs want to reach a final destination, and it would make sense that things would like connect that way. So it was nice that you showed that. Yeah, like the super complex view.
So that's a plus, Hayana, right? Because Dimitri, the comments also in the file. When I was reading, I wasn't sure. Are you mentioning that as a plus thing?
Yeah. I wrote my comment before he showed this slide, but that kind of connects to my next point, which is a question. As per this ideation, have you considered like how people would interact with this page? Because you showed the expand and collapse, right, on the upstream and downstream pipelines. But I'm not sure if you mentioned, I don't know, any exploration regarding like zooming in or out and pinching and swiping, because we know that the area on the interface, and I'm only thinking about the interface now, it's super limited. How do you kind of envision this from your experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't went too far yet with this. Basically, what I tried to do here is to have the initial building blocks ready and have the lines are easily, as I envision it, to be easily, stretchable. And in that way, make room for new nodes and those kind of things. If you, for example, highlight a job or click on it, then, for example, lines will be able to adjust in terms of being dotted or their color, or that way, show direct dependencies in a more visible way. But this all depends heavily on, hey, what does front end think is feasible for an MVC? And for now, this is why this kind of proposal seems kind of slim, but this has a lot of information in there. Hey, what is each individual building block? So, for example, this stage thing is a building block. The job itself, this little node which expands for the multiple lines, how it's being structured. Then you have indeed the downstream pipelines, which is expandable. This is actually one of the few examples which is indeed, as you show, has some interaction to it. But the current graph has that as well. So I thought it was kind of necessary to show. But I want to, though this not really shows yet the individual building blocks by itself, I think this is kind of like the first step needed for to have an interesting discussion with front end to see like, hey, can we actually do this? And look at this code I found and created those graphs with. Is this usable at all? Can we expand this? There are some problems existing with it, with the current scripts, as you can see here. But also, if we look into here, some lines overlap unnecessarily, which will create confusion. So yeah, so the TLDR, I did not go too far yet because it's heavily dependent on feasibility discussions before I go further. But yes, I intend to, for those these interactions to become a possibility for sure.
That's cool. Yeah, that answers my question. And what about the, my God, like the accessibility of the colors? Because I see it's super color right now. Is this something that it's still in the next step to validate that part, or have you already done experimentations with the color accessibility?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting, right? The colors as depicted here kind of only solves the use case of, hey, I want to more easily follow my dependency line. It is not so much that the color defines a true meaning, other than it needs to be a different kind of shade or different kind of like basic color than another line. But I wanted to make sure that we don't make mistakes, basically. So it's more like a check, like, hey, if we implement new things, did we not only rely on color, but also on shape, or vice versa? That was my my point with that point.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Dimitri. And yeah, I think next one in the agenda comments is Nadia.
Yeah, I saw +2, everything what you said, Hayana. Immediately thought about zoom in, zoom out thing when you wrote, and then I see that you wrote it there. Would be kind of like, I see it kind of like as a map, indeed, like probably at some point you want to go closer and then kind of like show me the bigger picture. I really like the visual, so I was wondering what Hayana was mentioning was like a plus or a minus about the subway map. But yeah, I agreed with Hayana as well. Like to me, it's visually appealing, but also like makes sense. And also, I think this connection between the map and the subway is kind of like it makes this connection, helps me to understand the whole thing better. But the only like fear that I have, it's there is a lot of like information and metrics that we would want to communicate to the user with this visualization. So I was curious, you know, like how are we gonna be explaining the dotted line? What does that mean? Maybe some like other statuses or like assignees, I don't know, dates if needed, all of those metrics that you showed in the presentation. Probably that's something to think about.
Yeah, I think so as well. Basically, I need to make an inventory of like all the different data we want to show and how it's like makes up in terms of building blocks. How I visualize, for example, the dotted lines. If a job has not been or has failed or has not been completed yet or is yet to run, for example, a manual job, the line that will follows out of that job. So we'll, you know, if say the job runs and it runs successfully, then this next job, which is dependent on this job, will run. And that's kind of like what this dotted line will show. And I hope what, for example, become possible is that if the pipeline is running and it completes and the job changes to a successful job, then that dotted line will become suddenly a solid one. So that will be a subtle CSS change, something which should be easily done in real time. But it kind of like in that way teaches the user the meaning of a dotted line without it as explicitly stating in the UI with a legend or something like that. Though, you know, if it remains you know, hard to read or not clear, I hope we catch those things with a potential solution validation exercise.
Yeah, cool. I will be looking forward to see the results of that. Ian, Mike, it seems you both have been trying to write something. Maybe you want to look.
I have been trying to figure out what particularly I want to say, but I wanted to call out that I think, just like Nadia and Hannah, the subway metaphor, one, it 100% registered with me too, because Boston, San Francisco, Amsterdam, they all look the same. They look like that, which is great. I was trying to think on the interaction. When you look at a single job detail, it would be kind of interesting if all of the other paths faded out, maybe to like half opacity, so you could see the exact path it took to get to a job. Might be a way to kind of clear that up.
Yeah, so a little bit into this. Let me see if I can find it. So this one here in the bottom right corner, you see that the other lines have been dotted, while the one that directly connects, but you mean towards the root job, right? Towards the, you know, the initial job that started all the way up towards the current job, I think.
Yeah, the latter was what I was thinking. So you could see the whole path and see when it's impacted, in case it isn't just the job before it that matters, but it could be 3 or 4 back that impacts that current one.
Yeah, I agree there. That would be interesting.
Yeah. That came out of the research, I think, if I can remember correctly, that they also wanted to use this to troubleshoot and troubleshoot quickly. So they needed to have a way to like zoom in or focus on the thing that failed and figure out what is it affecting and then what made it fail. So not only looking at the context around it, but also diving into that job easily and figuring out what happened.
Sounds good. Yeah, I'll make that point in my meeting tomorrow with mostly front end. I think the others will not be able to join, but I will be interested to see what he has to show. And I think it's going to be very nice if we eventually are finally able to zoom in on on a pipeline, which is kind of like this rigid current thing for the longest time.
So my question was around this. I'm assuming this is, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm assuming that what we're looking at is more like the pure DAG view. So I guess, is that a true statement? And then also, like, you know, how do stages work their way back into this? Or do you see that as a separate view? Like there's a stage view if you want, and there's DAG view if you want. Maybe you switch between those. So I'm just curious
so
about stages.
the idea of this is to really like that is a problem space, right? Like we want it all. It needs to support all of those models within the same view, so we don't have context switching between them. We don't need to maintain multiple views of the same thing. While as like we don't want to per se deprecate stage-based pipeline models. They need to be able to coexist as they already are supported. But perhaps to give you the best look into that is I kind of go a little bit into detail on it here, where I edited the graph of the previous one. So basically this, for example, I know it's a little bit fast, but here we can, for example, see, hey, prepare, here is the stage header, and then the jobs under it will mean that they are part of this stage. While, for example, future jobs that are dependent on one of those, for example, though they're here part of the build job or build stage, they can also be have other jobs depend on jobs within a stage. I go a little bit more into detail on this. So, for example, this is the stage. Should have given it a different name, but it has 3 jobs in it. And for example, this job group or this job, it depends on one of those jobs within the stage. So it can coexist in a way. But I have yet to make a like an example of a full graph which kind of like showcases that example as you would like it, because this is kind of minimal in the way that I depict it. But for sure, my intention is fully to support both at the same time, and I think it's very much a possibility.
Gotcha. Yeah, I would like to see, I think the hybrid one is like, the holy grail. But I would also like to see an example here of like the pure stage one, right? To make sure that we don't go down, right? I think that's where we are doing a good job today. So just want to make sure that experience stays at par or goes up.
Yeah, maybe I can give a small example even if Figma loads kind of fairly quickly. Give it a few seconds. So let's see. So for example, if we have this one, let's extend it a bit. So for example, this will be, come on. And then these lines will kind of not be necessary anymore.
Gotcha. Okay.
If that makes sense. So many lines.
I got it. I got it.
So kind of like it has this stage kind of like going down, and you'll have your jobs and it will still run. And if a job has a line of its own, that will mean that there is a DAG job dependent on that job from that stage, basically.
Gotcha.
It's kind of nice that Figma allows to so easily, combine it into this kind of presentation. Anyway,
if only front-end development was that easy, right? Like.
All right, thank you for the feedback. And if you have any other thoughts, please let me know on Slack or inside of the issue. You can find all the references inside of the presentation.
Yeah, you can find comments in the file as well, or watch the recording later if you will need to refresh your memory. Thanks a lot for showing. Mike, do you want to jump in and use the rest of the time for your issue, or actually, I know that we have this session 45 minutes eventually, so I don't know, maybe people prefer to drop and then move mics to the next one, whatever we feel like.
Yeah, whatever the team wants to do.
Who is up for staying for 5-10 minutes more, or people need to drop out and have a break? Dimitri, you probably have to go. 12 o'clock.
I need to drop off as well.
Minutes, but I'm all right with clipping it as well.
Yeah, right. I need to drop. I have to prepare for a meeting later today, and also we have the UX call in a couple of minutes.
Sure. Yeah, good call. Mike, I'll move you over to the next session if you don't mind.
Sounds good.
Cool. Thanks a lot for presenting, Dimitri. Thanks everyone for feedback. And yeah, talk to you soon in the UX call.